Okay, well, the last 2 decades saw some of the worst accounting scandals in history. Enron, WorldCom, and Lehman Brothers scandal as a phenomenal accounting scandal. Billions of dollars were lost as a result of these financial disasters, which destroys companies and ruin people's lives. Many of these accounting scandals were a result of this excessive greed of a few individuals whose actions lead to disastrous consequences, which broke down whole companies and affected millions of people. So, let me start today's international webinar, which will discuss fraud in accounting and business. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, honorable guests. Welcome to the International Seminar, Fraud in Accounting and Business. I'd also to welcome Honorable Dean of Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Mr. Abdul Gofar DBA AKCA, Vice Dean of Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Head of Accounting Department, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Ibu Yene Widya Prihatining Tias DBA AKCA, Head of Study Programs, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Vice Head of the Indonesian Institute of Accountants in East Java, Bapak Dr. Ardianto SCMSI AKCA, and our speakers and moderator today, Bapak Profesor Nurholis PhD AK from Universitas Brawijaya, Bapak Profesor Unti Ludikdo AK from Universitas Brawijaya, Mr. Profesor Norman Muhammad Saleh from University Kebangsaan Malaysia, Mr. Profesor Milin Satye from University of Canberra, Australia, Mr. Professor Li Chuanguan from Renmin University of China, Mr. Professor Peter Verhazen from University of Antwerp, Belgium. Also all lecturers and staff of Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, and also all participants, not only from Indonesia, but also from Singapore, Libya, Thailand, Germany, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, and China. Honorable guys, before we start the webinar, let's sing the Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Okay, thank you for all the participant who has sing the Indonesian National Anthem Indonesia Raya. Terima kasih kepada Bapak dan Ibu seluruh peserta yang telah berkenan untuk sejenak menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya. Honorable guests, first of all, thanks to our God who have given us mercies and blessing so we can attend and gather in this joyful webinar today and without any obstacle actually. And our opening session today will consist of the following sessions. The first is there will be opening speech, and then there will be a webinar session, and at the end of the session there will be a discussions. Well, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, honorable guests, the next session is speech by Head of Accounting Department, Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Ibu Yeni Widya Prihatining Tias, DBA AK. Time is yours. Monggo, Ibu.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Ayu Furi Puspita. Can everyone hear my voice here?
Clear.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Our honorable guests, the guests for the international seminar, Fraud in Accounting and Business from Indonesia as well as from around the globe. I here, Yeni Widya Prihatining Tias, as the head of Accounting Department, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, represents the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, to welcome all of you to our international seminar today. And our seminar today is conducted here with 5 honorable speakers from the Department of Accounting, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, and then also from Malaysia, from Singapore, from Australia, as well as from Belgium. Thank you for all of your coming today, and hopefully the seminar will give another insights about fraud and how to prevent fraud in the perspective of accounting and business. And our honorable speakers today will discuss in terms of fraud in different perspectives based on each speaker's presentation, and we do hope that all of you will enjoy the webinar, and there will also be a question and answer session at the end of the session. So again, we would like to open the seminar on behalf of the Dean, and I would also like to make apologize that our Dean today is not able to come due to certain event as well as meetings that the Dean has to attend at this moment. So thank you once again, as well as from the representatives from Indonesian Association of Accountants, from IAI Jawa Timur, who also come today to open the session. So I think that's all for now, Ibu Ayu Furi Puspita and all of the seminars attenders. Welcome to our seminar, and thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for the opening sessions, Ibu Yeni, as the head of Accounting Department, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya. Well, honorable guests, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, the next session is speech by Vice Head of the Indonesian Institute of Accountants in East Java, Bapak Dr. Ardianto SE, MSc HKCA. Bapak Dr. Ardianto, time is yours. Monggo, Bapak.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The Honorable Dean of Faculty of Economic and Business, Brawijaya University, and all of invited speakers, Professor Unti Lutikdo, and Professor Nur Khalis from Brawijaya University, Professor Norman Muhammad Saleh from University Kebangsaan Malaysia, Professor Milin Satye from University of Canberra, Australia, Professor Li Chuan Guan from Renmin University of China, Professor Verhessen from University of Antwerp, Belgium, the Honorable Chairman of International Seminar, presenter, participant, representative from partner universities, academia, all of the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Indonesian Institute of Accountant, it is indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome all of you to the International Seminar Fraud in Accounting and Business of 2022. Thanks to Brawijaya University or Universitas Brawijaya, especially to Department of Accounting, Faculty of Economic and Business, as this seminar serve an international forum for researchers, students, and academicians to exchange and share their experiences, ideas, and latest research result on fraud in accounting and business. As a partner in development in the field of accounting, Indonesian Institute of Accountant, or we say in the IAI, we call it IAI or Ikatan Akuntan Indonesia in Bahasa, we always support and appreciate every activity related to the accounting profession. This research also support the accounting profession, especially in understanding various aspects of related to fraud in accounting and business. So we would like to say thank you very much to Brawijaya University because of Wijaya already held these seminars. This international seminar has attracted prospective scholars and researchers to gather and seeking for future collaborative work among institutions, which will elevate the visibility of researchers or academicians in building an academic network. It also provides a chance to increase long-term partnership both domestically and internationally. Hopefully, through this platform, the seminar will continue to serve and encourage all the participants, and not only to present and share their ideas, but also to build a global network while learning the latest advancement and development in the area of fraud in accounting and business fields. While concluding, let us recognize the tremendous effort of the International Seminar Organizing Committee for the tireless effort in ensuring that the international seminar is conducted smoothly and successfully. Congratulations. I hope all the participants will find this international seminar to be fruitful with wonderful moment of knowledge and experience sharing. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oke, waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. Terima kasih banyak Bapak Dr. Ardianto yang telah berkenan untuk menyampaikan opening speech, your opening speech. Well, all of the honorable guests, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, all of the participants, the next session is the main sessions. Yeah, the next sessions is the webinar sessions, and this session will be moderated by Bapak Profesor Nurholis, PhD AK. He is a lecturer in Accounting Department, Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, and his expertise in public sector accounting. So I think time is your, Prof. Are you ready? Hello, Bapak Prof. Nurholis? Yeah. Okay, honorable guests, he will moderate the discussion session. So time is your, Prof.
Thank you very much, Bu Furi, as the master of ceremony. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Head of Accounting Department of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Brawijaya, my colleague, Pak Dr. Ardianto of Ikatan Akuntan Indonesia, Jawa Timur Chapter. Sehat-sehat Pak Ardianto. And I would like to mention also all of the speakers today. Keynote speakers, one is my colleague, Professor Untilu Dikto of Universitas Brawijaya, and then Professor Norman Muhammad Saleh, School of Accounting, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, Professor Maylin Satye of the Department of Accounting, Faculty of Business and Government and Law, University of Canberra, Professor Lee Chuan Guan, my colleague also, the professor from Renmin University of China, and Professor Peter Verhezen of the Antwerp Management School and University Belgium. First of all, as already mentioned by Master of Ceremony, Bu Furi, the background of this seminar, the important seminar, which topic of fraud in accounting as business are several. Number one is due to the accounting scandals, accounting and business scandals actually. And because of that, there is also more complex business environment at which fraud may happen in the future. And due to this, we also facing recently that there is a more urgent need to implement good corporate governance. That's why we think that this topic, fraud in accounting and business, is very important. And today, we will have one-day seminar in this topic. And as already I mentioned before, that we will listen to the 5 speakers. That's why I have to manage time very tightly. And as already been mentioned in the schedule, for each speakers, the allocation is more about actually approximately 90 minutes here for each speaker. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite speaker number 1, my colleague, Professor Unti Ludikto of the Department of Accounting, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Brawijaya, Malang, Indonesia. And before starting, Waalaikumsalam. Before starting this session, I would like to briefly read the curriculum vitae of the Professor Unti Ludikto. Professor Unti Ludikto hold accounting degree, undergraduate accounting degree from Universitas Brawijaya, and then he also hold master's degrees in accounting from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Yogyakarta, and he also hold PhD degree in accounting from Universitas Brawijaya. He is the full professor at Department of Accounting, Brawijaya University. He teaches business ethics and governance. And currently, he serves as a dean at the School of Vocational Studies of Brawijaya University. Before, he also served as the dean of the Faculty of Science and Political Studies at the University of Brawijaya. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Unti Ludikto. Professor Ludikto, time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Nurkhalis. And for all participants in seminar, I would like to thank you for organizing committee, especially head of Department of Accounting, Brawijaya University, and all of the leader in Faculty of Economics and Business. Today, I would like to short review about the topic in fraud in business. I think it is interested topic discussed in many fields in accounting and business. In short review, I try to show about the definition and multiple case in fraud topic, especially in digital era. It's okay, Pak Nurkhalis. It's clear my
Yeah.
presentation?
Yes, clear.
Okay, thank you. We know that today we have entered to digital age. What is the digital age? There are a period in human history characterized by the shift from a traditional industry to an economy based on information and communication technology. And the other digital era is the period where digital technologies play a prominent role in shaping up and regulating the behavior. And the others, in digital era, many our behavior change, include performance and standard in the world. Also, values in societies, communities, organization, and individual change change too, I think. So we have to change our mind, our thinking about the our way of work, I think. Lots of things we use information technology and also artificial intelligence tools. Tools for IT access are becoming easier to obtain, and various information and data are also easily accessible in digital era. In digital era, we face a negative impact. Many problems we can face. Otherwise, the positive impact can our take. A negative impact, the example is accessing a computer to defraud and obtain value. And then intentional access and damage, trafficking in passwords. I think it is our problem is today. Many people use IT tools, so we have to enter the gadget. We have to enter password, and then trespassing the computer. And the other, I think it is in scope of the word. This is economic espionage. This is the problem to many countries, I think, because the one country and the other try to espionage how the economic potential can access in the others. And then we will try to discuss about what is the fraud. In the whole definition, fraud is wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. This is the common definition about fraud. And the specific in accounting, fraud is the deliberate manipulation and alteration of financial records and statement. What is the personal or people intend to do fraud? Maybe we can try to deeply thinking, but why the people intend to do fraud? Generally, people obtainment of monetary benefit by persona. Maybe we can talk not just by personal, but maybe by groups or by communities, or maybe by official government, maybe, to obtain benefit of monetary. The others generally giving leverage to other crime. Maybe by personnel, someone not intend to give benefit for themselves, but someone give leverage to others, give away to others to do criminal, I think. In accounting term, intent to fraud, pleasing shareholders and investors by displaying the financial performance of the firm to be better than what it really is. So the accountant or the official of accounting field to make up the financial reporting, so to be better than real financial condition. Second, attempting unlawful tax evasion by misstating assets and liabilities and revenues and expense. To intense manipulation amount of tax payment, the corporation or the personal incorporation make making the statement or financial statement is not really a condition. Third, gaining competitive advantage in the market. The case we can hear about the price of the market after IPO, event. Why the low price in the market, the lower price in the market happen? Maybe fraud happen in the corporation. And the last, manipulating the stock price of the company. It is the potential area to fraud. I try to short review about the multiple fraud mode in the digital world. It is just example mode of fraud in a digital era. I am sure that many cases can happen in the digital era. So fraud can do by person or by communities. One, payment method. Yes, I think today we have entered in a cashless era. So we have to pay. We have to pay something with a card and the other tools. Cashless payments have become arena for fraud, and incident is increase. Refer to the United States case in 2021 about the payment method. A bank transfer or payment fraud resulted in losses amounting to $756 million US. And this is a loss, value of fraud loss. This is case in United States. Refer to Nielsen report. And Nielsen report to make forecasts about the car fraud over the next decade will cost the industry a collective about $400 billion in loss globally. I think it is the big amount, I think. This reflects the overall increase in sophistication and targeting of social engineering and phishing in payment method. And the other fraud in digital tools is subscriber identity module swapping. And this is one of the new key trends in fraud by digital tools. This is having caused significant losses and attracted considerable attention from law enforcement. I think in Indonesia is also happened, and many people lost. And the yes, big one, I think. The other business email compromise. This is arena of fraud whose incidence continues to increase. This form of fraud have entered the spotlight due to the sheer number of victims they have generated. About this, I try to search about the loss in the fraud case occur in a company in Australia. Perpetrators who had hacked the emails of the company's chief executive officer and chief operation officer sent email as if they were them. In the first email, the perpetrators impersonating the CEO asked the finance clerk to transfer the funds. Lastly, around 47% of fake email targeted chief financial officer. The impact refer to data about the $26 billion loss in a package. I think we have to improve our awareness about the situation, I think. The other fraud commonly happen in corporation. We know that computerized fraudulence occurs when someone tampers with the input or with the output of data that damage the firm's financial situation. The source of corporate fraud can come from external and internal. From external fraud is the most common type of fraud. A system are entered or hacked. And hacker doing to do something false in the corporate data. From internal frauds are committed by insiders who belong to the organization and receive a username, password, and authorization in a formal and recognized manner in order to perform their role. I think this is most persons to get gain to do fraud. So what we have to do to save our corporation from fraud. Refer to Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment or IUCTA 2020, for businesses, the businesses have to do one, establish corporate policies and procedure. So management of corporation have to establish clear corporate policies and build standard operating procedure. Then secure the corporate communications tools and the device in technology information for communication tools. The others, raise up awareness about the risk of teleworking. So hacker can access our data, our staff have to have high awareness about the risk. The other, secure your teleworking equipment and regularly check in with staff, and then provide secure remote access. So multiple step access to data will be built, I think. Then keep device operating system and apply it update. So the updating device is also important to do. The last, increase the security monitoring. Yes, this is, I think, remind to our data, our data in university, I think, will be safe. So we have to increase our data will high level security monitoring. For employees, employees have to access company data with corporate equipment. We commonly use our device by link with the public access. I think this is a gimmick for us, which we try to access the corporate our company data, I think. Use secure remote access. Consequences for secure remote access. So we have to use secure remote access. Keep business and leisure apart. And avoid giving out personal information. I think it is an important thing for us. Think before connecting. Need or not need, I think, but our connection in our device. Protect your teleworking equipment and environment, and stay alert. Then report suspicious activity, develop new routines, and last, be careful when using private device for telework. I think this is our short review about the digital era, fraud in digital era. Pak Nurkolis, thank you. And time back to you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Unti. Professor Unti already explained about what is fraud. Actually, it is deliberate manipulation in accounting data, in financial statements, or any other business settlements. That the keyword is the business deliberation to manipulate. And also, Pak Unti already mentioned types of fraud that may happen in our environment due to the in the digital era. So let's give appreciation or applause to Professor Unti Lutikto. Actually, we still have 5 minutes, Professor Unti, and I checked first whether my colleague from Malaysia, Professor Norman Muhammad Sadeh. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here already.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Norman. Because Prof. Norman already ready, so I would like to pass the session to Professor Norman. Professor Norman, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon. The chairperson of the session, honorable guest, ladies and gentlemen, Alhamdulillah, all praise and shukr to Allah, and salawat and salam to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this international seminar, Fraud in Accounting and Business. So today I would like to present just a common idea about the landscape of corporate governance in Asia, and perhaps to look at how effective mechanisms of corporate governance can prevent fraud. And from here, perhaps we can get more idea and factors or approaches that should be emphasized in the Asian corporate governance research. Okay, next, please. So I think everybody knows about the definition of corporate governance. Just a little bit on this before we proceed. So corporate governance is a system by which companies are directed and controlled. So a system is defined as a set of principles, practices, and as correctly said by the previous presenter, procedures that are applied to specific activities to achieve specific results. So they have all these practices and procedures, and the board of directors is actually at the center of corporate governance that is responsible for an efficient system, which includes the internal control or check and balance systems, risk governance. We know about this, I think, issue recently, most related to risk governance, and data governance, among many others. So today, the premise of our discussion is in the property rights perspective that was shaped by customs, social norms, law and legal systems that actually differentiate Asia from the rest of the world. So we are actually very different operating in Asian countries. Okay, next. All right. So this is actually just a background information. The statistic is about corporate governance score, which was obtained from the Asian Corporate Governance Association. This is based on their survey on selected companies in Asia, and their research tracks corporate governance development across 12 markets in the Asia Pacific and produce independent analysis of new laws and regulations, investor engagement, and corporate practices. So as we can see from the figure, it appears that Australia, although Australia is like a country, or it is also arguably whether it is part of Asia, but comparing to other Asian countries, Australia lead the way, followed by Malaysia and Thailand, which despite the recent political challenges, have long had a solid set of laws and regulations. Okay, and then Hong Kong and Singapore are slightly behind in 2018 and 2020. So even in Asia, the corporate governance practices appear to be different and shaped by the local customs and market. Okay, next. Ownership structure is one of key issues in corporate governance. Okay, so besides the board of directors, ownership structure is an issue. So although high concentration of ownership is common among Asian corporations, the extensiveness of cross-shareholdings and pyramid structure varies across Asian economies. Cross-holding or pyramid structure is quite popular in Korea and Taiwan. In this type of shareholding, control right is often larger than cash flow right. So we always heard about these terms, right? In finance, control right versus cash flow right. So giving rise to expropriation activities. So when these two actually, going in different directions, so it gives rise to expropriation activities. However, it was reported that in Thailand, almost 80% of the controlling shareholders do not employ cross-shareholdings or pyramid structure, which is good. And in addition to family, family ownership is also a dominant feature of Asian ownership structure. The state controls a significant number of listed companies in several economies, such as in Singapore, Malaysia, and predominantly in China. Okay, so these facts must be acknowledged before we venture into looking at how corporate governance, in particular ownership structure, could have some impact on fraud or expropriation activities in companies. Okay, and next, can we go and have a look at the evidence about family ownership? Okay, so continuing from here, we investigate the influence of family ownership and related party transactions in Malaysia. So it appears that the results suggest the influence of family ownership on earnings quality is more dominant in firms that engage in expropriation activities or to a certain extent fraud than in firms that do not engage in such activities. Okay, you can see in the table, FAM times by RPT. RPT is related party transaction. FAM is family ownership. You can see that it has a significant positive relationship, showing that family ownership with related party transaction is related to earnings quality. However, a negative relationship between family ownership and earnings quality is showing once family ownership is too large. Okay, so negative relationship, we can see that when FAM square times RPT, the coefficient is negative and significant, that is when the expropriation occurs. So it can be concluded that more dominant effect of family ownership on earnings quality for firms that engage in related party transaction that could result in expropriation is consistent with the alignment and entrenchment effect. Okay, so it is important to note that family ownership would only influence earnings quality if the companies actually engage in the expropriation activities through related party transactions. So, it is not by looking at, when there is a high family ownership, the earnings quality is reduced, but we also investigate the mechanism through which this can be done, which is going through a related party transaction. Okay. Okay, next. Now we can go into the details on the nature of ownership structure in Asia. The effect of ownership structure is based on the property right literature. We can view that both individual owners and state can enforce property rights. In economies where state does not effectively enforce property rights, meaning usually in less developed countries, enforcement by individual owners will be most important. Okay, the structure of share ownership itself will then affect the degree of how contracts can be enforced, because it affects owners' abilities and incentive to enforce their rights. So when the state fails to enforce regulation related to the property right, then individuals through ownership would like to take over that role. They are the one who can determine the degree of rights that they have. So one prediction from this argument is that more concentrated ownership will be observed in economies where property rights are not well enforced by the state. Okay, so we can see actually this is happening mostly in Asia. So without relying on the state, controlling owners obtain the power through high voting rights and the incentives through high cash flow rights to negotiate and enforce corporate contracts with various stakeholders, including minority shareholders, managers, laborers, material suppliers, customers, stakeholders, and government. So as you can see, so the source of the problem rests in this relationship. That is when the regulation, the rules and regulation are not well enforced by the state. Okay, so therefore the weak state enforcement of property rights is the most probable cause of the concentrated ownership of Asian corporations, as they often confront weak legal system, poor law enforcement, and corruption. Okay, likewise, the weak property rights system in Asia may also explain why family-run business groups have been the dominant organizational forms. So actually, there are reasons on why this is happening in Asia, why family ownerships are more dominant in Asia, why concentration, the level of concentration is higher in Asia. It is from the legal system. It is from the poor law enforcement and corruption. And looking at the controlling shareholder ownership structure and conflict-related party transactions, this is another evidence which we have done the research on Malaysian data. The evidence suggests that, or before the evidence, we can have a look at the variables. So we divided the controlling shareholders into direct controlling shareholders, DCS, indirect controlling shareholders, INDCS, and the pyramidal shareholding. Okay, and we look at their relations with conflict-related party transaction. So conflict-related party transaction has been defined, and we select the items to look into the items. So this study shows that controlling shareholders expropriate the company's wealth not only through direct shareholding, but also through indirect and pyramidal shareholding, but mostly through direct shareholding. And we found that companies with large direct, indirect, and pyramidal ownership at more than 33% of shareholding engage with conflict-related party transaction. Okay, and the adjusted is quite high, 82.2%. Okay, next. Now, we look at the incentives of the concentrated ownership. So we have talked about the family ownership. We have talked about the state ownership, which is, I think, unique in Asian context. So the reason behind the concentrated ownership is still at the cash flow right versus control right. So as we all know, the ownership structure will affect the nature of the agency problem between managers and outside shareholders and among shareholders. So when ownership is diffuse, meaning that they are scattered, they are well distributed, as is typical for US and UK corporations, agency problems will stem from conflict of interest between outside shareholders and managers. So we always regard this as type 1 agency problem. On the other hand, when ownership is concentrated to the degree that one owner has effective control of the firm, as is typically the case of Asia, the nature of agency problem shifts away from manager-shareholder conflicts to conflicts between controlling owner, who is often the manager as well, and minority shareholders. So the nature of agency problem is actually different in most corporations in Asia. Therefore, entrenchment effect can happen when minority shareholders who are entitled to the cash flow rights corresponding to their shares of equity face the uncertainty that the entrenched controlling owner may opportunistically deprive them of their right. The controlling owner take charge. The controlling owner, maybe they tunnel the wealth of the companies to their benefit. So separation between ownership rights and control rights can exacerbate the entrenchment problem raised by concentrated ownership. Okay, so to consolidate control, stocks pyramid or cross-holding can be used, which lower the cash flow investment needed. The controlling owner in this situation could extract wealth from the firm, receive the entire benefit, but only bear a fraction of the cost through a lower cash flow ownership. So this is what I'm saying, why the incentives increase, if the incentive to expropriate increase because of divergence between the cash flow rights and control right. They have control, but the impact on cash flow is very, very low, and through indirect relationship, indirect control. Okay, and alignment effect is happening once the controlling owner obtains effective control of the firm, and any increase in voting right does not further entrench the controlling owner. Higher cash ownership, however, means that it will cost the controlling owner more to divert the firm's cash flow for private gain. Therefore, they don't have the incentive to do that, because it affects their cash flow to the owner. So they will not expropriate minority shareholders when the cash flow ownership is high. So the issue of ownership and firm value is more complicated when the state is controlling owner. When the state is the controlling owner. It happens in Malaysia, it happens in maybe Singapore, where the state has control or stakes or shareholding in companies. Because first, the state is not the ultimate owner of the firm, of the company, but instead the agent of the ultimate owner, which is the citizen. So the citizens is actually the ultimate owner. So, and a friend of mine asked me whether, if the citizens is the ultimate owner, whether the results is presented in a parliament. I'm not so sure. Okay, so whether more cash flow ownership has the alignment effect matters. So it depends, because the incentives of the state can deviate from the owners because of political economy, corruption, etc. So we cannot guarantee that it is fully transparent. Then the state can also deviate from the owner's incentives. The owner is the citizen, so the state may act not to the benefit of the citizens. Okay, so moreover, the state as owner faces many conflicts of interest, as it also regulates and enforces law, regulates and often controls the banking systems, and more generally is concerned about other factors such as employment. So if they have such incentives, they may decide something that would benefit their political agenda, such as votes, at the expense of the company. Second, there can be different types of government agencies that control the equity stakes of companies. Okay, it can be from agencies, it can be from the Prime Minister's incorporation. For example, ownership by the central government can have quite different incentives from ownership by the local government. There is just an example. There could be more types of government ownerships, and the level of monitoring can be different. Okay. Third, if the state-controlled firms are located in socialist countries or ex-communist countries, it becomes difficult to interpret any relations between ownership and performance without taking into account the institutional structures that are quite different. Like you are looking at China in 1990s when they first moved to free market. The involvement of, I've read articles on the involvement of ex-army in the high rank position in companies. I'm not saying that it is good or not good, but it poses a different perspective, or we should look into that with caution. It can be benefit, it can be damaging. Okay, next. So corporate governance in Asia mostly rests on these items. We look at the minority shareholders, while the minority shareholders are active. We look at the mechanisms to discipline the board through takeovers and internal governance. And there are alternative governance mechanisms which may complement the internal governance on the board. Okay. Right. Next, we look at that one by one. Okay. So looking at the monitoring by shareholders, minority shareholders. So minority shareholders may directly monitor the firm when they hold significant equity stakes and when they have a significant portion of the shares. But it is unclear whether they are effective in challenging the powerful controlling owners, especially in the AGM. Okay. Studies indicate that minority shareholders can influence controlling owners' decision when they collectively hold a significant block of equity. So when they collude and when they form allies, perhaps with other minority shareholders, then they have a very significant block there who can ask questions, significant questions in the AGM, and also maybe they have representative in the board of directors. In Malaysia, we established the Minority Shareholders Watch Group, MSWG. Okay, so the MSWG was established to protect the interests of minority shareholders through shareholders activism. So, the MSWG improve the activism of the shareholders through issuance of guideline of how to attend AGM. They also attended AGMs to monitor the process of governance in the AGM. Okay. And another aspect is the role of certification. Okay. One possible corporate governance role of institutional investors in Asia and emerging markets in general is certification. When ownership is concentrated and a firm is subject to agency conflict between controlling owners and minority shareholders, the firm may invite institutional investors' equity participation. So when they have institutional investors as part of their equity, so they can borrow their reputation to enhance its credibility to monitor shareholders, minority shareholders. Okay, so it is just being used to certify that they actually have a certain level of governance going on. Okay, but in fact, it may or may not lead to subsequent improvement in corporate governance or be accompanied by active monitoring. So it is just on paper and maybe to deal with the perception of the minority shareholders that they have a certain level of minimum corporate governance. Okay, next. About takeovers and internal governance. So compared with the USA and UK, conventional governance mechanisms such as board of directors and takeovers are weak in most emerging markets. It's not usually happening here. Okay, and in Asia, hostile and disciplinary takeovers are extremely rare. Takeovers incentivize managers to make sure good corporate governance are in place or practice. And so this is actually the external mechanism that is happening. So the governance, the companies, the board of directors are being aware of that takeovers could happen. They should have a good corporate governance in order to deal with that risk. Okay. Okay. And there are practices in Asia whereby board of directors of companies are still dominated by insiders and hardly have any outsider presence. Okay, so these companies are more likely to insert family members on board. So when there are so many insiders on board, so they usually have family members on the board. Okay, especially when their voting rights substantially exceed cash flow rights of the firm. In China, politicians and state controlling owners occupy most board seats. And so, before the millennium, it was reported that almost 50% of the directors are appointed by state controlling owners, and another 30% are affiliated with various layers of government agencies. Okay, and there are very few professionals, lawyers, accountants, or finance experts on these boards. So, given the conventional governance mechanisms are weak, are managers of Asian firms disciplined at all when they perform their duties poorly? Okay, so because of that, we can rely on the alternative governance mechanisms. So we can have a look at these governance mechanisms, which are coming actually from the outside of the company. So weak minority owners, inactive boards, and limited takeover markets are unlikely to challenge the controlling owner's self-interested activities. Okay, so the external auditors are one of the mechanisms that can actually monitor the management. Firms are more likely to employ Big Five auditors when they are subject to agency problems in their ownership structure. So if they have this kind of thing in the ownership structure, to deal with that, they employ Big Five audit firms. So Big Five audit firms or Big Four audit firms has been, sorry, Big Four, it should be Big Four, has been, notified or as quality auditors, because they have the systems, they have the specializations, industry specializations. And there are evidence that these big firms have a role here in Asia. And auditor designation constrains the ability for income increasing earnings management. Okay, and it happens in the control companies, especially in Korea, where they are heavily affiliated with chaebol in Korea. So most of them are appointing Big Four audit firms. And the merit of using regulatory means in place of firms' voluntary governance is still debatable. Whether you want to make it mandatory or mandatory regulation, or voluntary governance. Which one is more effective? Evidence suggests that while the Chinese government made effort to improve auditor independence, domestic firms listed in China took flight from high quality to low quality auditors. And our results, our research results shows that using 4 countries' data, the auditors' attitude of professional skepticism improved their ability in assessing risk of material misstatement. Results suggest that as the level of professional skepticism increase, auditors become more thorough and cautious in assessing the risk of material misstatement and in making audit decisions. Okay, so as you can see in the first figure, auditor skepticism is one important factor that determines the quality of an audit. Okay, the figure suggests that the effect of professional skepticism on auditors' assessment of risk of material misstatement differ with different levels of time budget pressure. So when they have more budget pressure, the assessment, is more effective. The assessment of misstatement risk is more effective when they have low time budget pressure. When they have time budget pressure, high time budget pressure, but it actually reduces the assessment of misstatement of risk. Okay. And in the second figure shows that regardless of auditors' level of professional skepticism, less experienced auditor, such as audit juniors, set lower level of risk assessment of material misstatement. As you can see from the blue line there, that is for junior auditor. Okay. And results suggest that more experienced auditors recognize the significance of risk element in the exercise of assessing material misstatement. As you can see, the senior is represented by the green line, and the manager or partner in the light green, or light green line. And you can, as you can see, the manager or partner has more as higher impact of professional skepticism on the assessment of the risk of misstatement. Okay, so I think this is when we need to underscore the importance of managing the time budget pressure and the experience in detecting counting misstatements. Okay. And next, still about audit and auditor regulation. Okay, this is another evidence of audit and audit regulators rating by Asian Corporate Governance Association. And as you can see, Australia again has the highest score. Okay, and the 3 highest rating is Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Okay. Okay, next. And this is okay. The next figure is about, I'm going to finish soon. Okay. The legal environment and the public governance. This is actually the role of public governance as perceived by the market. Okay, So there are also differences in the perception of legal environment and public governance in the market across different countries in Asia. So it could be because of this that the governance in each country is different. Okay. Next. Okay, so maybe I would like to conclude that uniquely Asian group affiliation, group diversification is unique. Group affiliation in Asia, that 70% of listed companies in 9 East Asian economies are group affiliated, and in Asia, as most in other emerging markets, families typically control the groups, and also the role of the state is also important. And looking at the state ownership, it is also important to see the mechanism or the way how they control the market. The level of diversification is more than in other countries or across the world. And the firms in less developed countries, Asia, use more external than internal funds to finance their investment project. So this is also another source of issues whereby heavier reliance on external funds simply reflects the fact that their investment needs far exceed internally generated cash flow. So they need more monitoring for any risk of expropriation from the parties involved. Okay, I think with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Nurman Saleh, for sharing with us about landscape of corporate governance in Asia. Professor Nurman also already raised some related issues regarding the ownership structure, family ownership, and then the incentive effect of the concentrated ownership, and then more specifically explain about the corporate governance mechanisms in Asia and also alternative governance and auditor skepticism. Thank you again, Professor Norman. Now we shall proceed to the next session. Our speaker is Dr. Mylin Shetty. He is a professor at the University of Canberra, and he was also a former head of the Department of Accounting from 2004 till 2013. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Mylin Shetty. Professor Shetty, time is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. The topic of my talk is the financial crime, present status.
Professor Shetty.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Oh, yes, clear.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. And The topic of my presentation is financial crime, present status, and the way ahead. Good afternoon, selamat datang, and good day to everyone from Australia. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. I congratulate the organizers for choosing such an important topic for the conference. It is a timely topic given that financial crime is a major problem facing the world today. The World Economic Forum reports that every year about 2 to 5% of world GDP, that is 2 trillion US dollars, is laundered. However, less than 1% has been seized so far. It means our efforts to combat financial crime have met with limited success. It was found that in 2017 alone, private sector spent more than 8 billion US dollars on anti-money laundering control measures. Given the magnitude of the crime and the cost to the society, urgent actions are called for combating money laundering. In the World Economic Forum, they have established a global coalition to fight financial crime. This highlights that the problem is not specific to any one country, but is a global issue. The International Monetary Fund is also worried about the consequences of financial crime on economies of various countries. The United Nations Office on Drug and Crime is specially set up to assist member states to address the threat posed by drugs, crime, and terrorism. It is against this background that I speak on the topic financial crime, present status, and the way ahead. What can be better than to begin the talk with a Netflix film? Not sure how many of you have seen the film, The Pharmacist. The film is based on a true story of a pharmacist in the United States. His son was shot while attempting to buy cocaine in New Orleans. As it happens with all criminal investigations, the police were slow in investigating, but the dogged determination of the father to find the killers of his son finally nailed the entire drug-pushing operation. The kingpin, interestingly, was a lady medical doctor. The doctor was prescribing OxyContin, a painkiller. Purdue Pharma, the manufacturers of this drug, were eventually charged for producing this addictive drug, and the lawsuit eventually led to the demise of Purdue Pharma. However, in the interregnum, the drug had claimed more than 46,000 lives from overdose related to opioids. The medical doctor who was prescribing the drug to almost every patient and thus aiding to spread its use and addiction eventually lost her license to practice. Though the justice system could only cancel her license to practice, her bad karma, it seems, caught up with her, and she was involved in a car accident that damaged her brain besides causing serious injuries. This is an interesting real-life story, though it is over a decade old. Ordinarily, selling illicit drugs would invite severe punishment, but here a pharma company and a medical doctor were pushing drugs under the guise of medical treatment. A recent case is that of Roger Ng, a top executive with Goldman Sachs for Malaysia. The US jury convicted him in April this year for his role in helping embezzle hundreds of millions of dollars from Malaysia's 1MDB development fund. It seems he helped his former boss, Tim Lesner, to embezzle money from the fund, launder the proceeds, and bribe officials to win business for Goldman Sachs. While these are the cases of individuals gone astray, the Royal Commission into Misconduct in the banking, superannuation, and financial services industry in Australia, in its 2019 report, brought out many malpractices that bug the Australian financial industry. In a 2018 case against Australia's largest and most profitable bank, it was found that drug syndicates and gun dealers used the Commonwealth Bank of Australia's intelligent ATMs to launder millions of dollars for years. The bank admitted that its failures prevented the police from disrupting money laundering by the crime syndicates. It had to pay 700 million Australian dollars civil penalty to settle its anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing case with Austrac, which is the financial intelligence agency in Australia. Indonesia is not behind in financial crime either. The Asia Pacific Group 2018 report found that Indonesia has a high risk of terrorist financing. The report found that corruption, narcotics, and taxation as the three main proceeds or money laundering generating predicate offenses. The Survive fraud in Indonesia rocked the world some years back. These cases are pointers to the fact that money laundering and fraud are the two major categories of financial crime. Sometimes fraud and financial crime are considered as synonymous, Though the difference between financial crime and fraud is blurring, the two can be differentiated. McKinsey notes that financial crime has generally meant money laundering and a few other criminal transgressions, including bribery and tax evasion, involving the use of financial services in support of criminal enterprises. It is most often addressed as a compliance issue, as when financial institutions avert fines with anti-money laundering activities. Fraud, on the other hand, generally designates a host of crimes such as forgery, credit scams, and insider threats involving deception of financial personnel or services to commit theft. Refinitiv, a London Stock Exchange Group company, considers that financial crime is a broader term and includes frauds, money laundering, theft, bribery, and corruption, cybercrime, and slavery, human trafficking as well. Accordingly, in this talk, I will focus on two issues: money laundering and corporate fraud. Precise statistics of the magnitude of money laundering by country is not available, since it is difficult to estimate it, though several methods have been proposed. International agencies such as the Basel have developed the Basel AML Index, which indicates the risk scores of AML in a country. The scores are calculated from publicly available sources such as the Financial Action Task Force, Transparency International, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum. The 5 domains that are assumed to be impacting money laundering and terrorism financing risk are selected, and indicators are developed in total to compute a country's risk score. The 5 domains include the quality of AML CFT framework, bribery and corruption, financial transparency and standards, public transparency and accountability, and legal and political risks. As reported in Indonesia Risk Assessment on Money Laundering 2021, a report published by Intrac, the Basel AML Risk Index for Indonesia improved from 5.73 in 2018 to 4.62 in 2020. Obviously, it goes to the credit of the Indonesian authorities that considerable progress has been made in addressing the issues raised by the Asia Pacific Group Mutual Evaluation Reviews. Yet, the efforts continue to be made. The APG Mutual Evaluation Review found that Indonesia was fully complied only in 6 scores. In 29 scores, it was largely compliant. In 4, it was partially compliant. And in 1, it was non-compliant. Given the magnitude of the problem and slow progress in complying with FATF standards, it appears that the battle against money laundering and terrorism financing risk would continue to be waged for a long time to come. It is important to know that as agencies are getting more savvy to address money laundering and terrorism financing risk, the counterparty, that is the criminal gangs, are becoming sophisticated too. Newer and innovative ways for committing the financial crime are being devised. The way ahead would involve giving a bigger role to the private sector in the fight against MLTF risk. It is the first point of contact at the placement stage before layering and eventual integration can take place. Consequently, the capacity of the private sector in detecting the MLTF risk, as well as funding for proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, needs to be considerably improved. COVID-19 has shown us that a virus can bring the entire world to a standstill. It is reported that it was accidentally let off from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, but we have seen the consequences. It is also possible that such biological weapons can be used deliberately to achieve military aims. Another important point is the need to devise strategies to not only prevent the occurrence of MLTF and WMD related risks, but also to eradicate the occurrence thereof. Simultaneously, it is critically important that asset recovery is done speedily. The Intrac report highlights that Indonesia is taking several steps to produce important outputs for strengthening its AML-CFT regime. Towards this aim, Indonesia is strengthening collaboration internationally. Such cooperation with International Financial Agency and AML regulators is critically important since money laundering and terrorism financing is usually a cross-border operation. The mutual evaluation report lays down several gaps that are present in Indonesia's AML CTF regime, which the authorities need to address to become fully compliant with FATF international standards. It is not my intention to mention all of these here. While MLTF risk may have international implication, fraud risk is generally confined within the country. Several categories of fraud are identified in the literature. These include 5 main types: corruption, conflict of interest, theft of assets, false reporting, or falsifying performance, and technological abuse. In the Indonesian context, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners found in its report 2019 that corruption is the most common fraud in Indonesia. Nearly 70% of the cases surveyed by the association involved corruption, and the total loss was more than 373 billion rupiah. It was mainly the government that suffered the losses. The loss suffered by private companies was between 500 million to 1 billion rupiah, while that suffered by the government was more than 10 billion rupiah. A report published by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners in 2022 found that occupational frauds occur in 5 major industries: real estate, wholesale trade, transportation and warehousing, construction, and utilities. Globally, organizations lose 5% of the revenue due to fraud, and the losses caused by fraud have been estimated at the order of 3.6 billion US dollars. Frauds are typically motivated by greed and a belief that it would not be caught. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners found that 42% of the frauds were detected because tips were received. Furthermore, it was found that nearly half of the fraud cases took place due to lack of internal controls or due to overriding of the controls. To reduce the risk of fraud, organizations take several measures. These include formulating a risk committee, which is generally a subcommittee of the board, formulating a risk policy, periodic appraisal, instituting preventive controls such as physical security, policy and process control, due diligence, and technical controls. I will now narrate a case from my personal experience. I was contacted by a solicitor as an expert witness in a court case, given my expertise in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. It was a case of an organization where the chief finance officer, in collusion with the bank staff, transferred millions of dollars from organization's account to his personal account. He was the only authorized signatory. When the fraud came to light, the bank abdicated all responsibility. The solicitor then contacted me. He said that the organization has resigned to the fate that the court will absolve the bank of any responsibility, as it is the internal control issue and the organization has clearly erred. After I read the case, I advised that the bank is equally responsible and cannot shirk its duty of care. The bank knew that millions were being transferred from the organization's account to the personal account of the CFO, and it had a duty to report it as a suspicious activity. The bank has failed, and you should raise this with the bank. Within a week, the solicitor telephoned to me and was beaming with joy. The bank agreed to settle the case out of court and bear a part of the loss. Financial crime is no different from the weed that grows in your backyard. Just when you feel you have finally uprooted it, it springs up again. I would urge the participants in the conference to deliberate on finding ways to measure the magnitude of money laundering and assessing newer dimensions of fraud, especially the cyber fraud. I conclude with a suggestion. Early on in the talk, I gave a reference to a Netflix film, The Pharmacist. In a lighter vein, I suggest that to prevent financial crime, you should watch more Netflix films. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Thank you, Prof. Chatier. Ladies and gentlemen, we got another perspectives of fraud in a broader perspective, we are using financial crimes. Financial crime is a broader term that could include fraud, money laundering, theft, corruption, bribery, and so on. That all of them are already been explained clearly by Professor Satye. Thank you very much, and let's give applause to Professor Satye. Thank you very much, and please stay with us. We are now moving to the next session. The next session, we have another keynote speech from Renmin University of China. It's Professor Li Chuan-Guan. So the topic that will be delivered by Professor Li is the future of business, challenges and opportunities. Professor Li,
Thank you. Sorry.
Was first appointed as a young professor by Jilin Agricultural Science and Technology University, China, subsequently by Huai University and Renmin University of China. Now, he is also a practitioner of alternative dispute resolution. Yeah, that is the another important thing. Now, Professor Li is empaneled with the World Intellectual Property Organization. I think some of the important information regarding Professor John Lee. So now, Professor Lee, time is yours.
Thank you, Professor Nicholas. Can you? My audio is working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Honorable Ibu Yeni, Head Department of Accounting. Honorable Dr. Haryanto, Vice Head Indonesian Accountant Association in East Java, learned faculty colleagues, Bapak dan Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, Sugeng Siang. It is my pleasure to be part of this international seminar organized by University Brawijaya. My presentation will be focused on sustainability, the opportunity and challenges. And as the theme of this seminar is fraud in accounting and businesses, for challenges, I shall highlight the fraud and the risk of crime in sustainability. Next slide, please. Since time immemorial, no organization or business are established to fail. They are established not only to succeed, but into the future as well. Hence, in a sense, we have been embracing sustainability. But in this 21st century, the sustainability practice will come in the form of 3 R's: reducing waste, reusing resources, recycling resources. Now we are also focused more on people and planet rather than just profit or prosperity. And this will lead us from the current economic model of linear to circularity. And within the sustainability, you will see that the word ESG will come about, which is about the environment, the social, and the governance. And of the last few years, the cornerstone of sustainability are, next slide, thank you, United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, which was agreed upon by the international community, and it will be for 15 years up to 2030. And at about the same time, in 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the UN Sustainable Development Goal. It has 17 goals, but you can see that it is within the ESG, which is describing the environment, the social, and the governance. Next, please. And you have the Paris Agreement. That agreement was signed, and it was the 21st, COPA 21st meeting. That is, the full name actually is the UN Climate Change Conference. The last conference is the COPA 26. Next, please. Which was last year held in Scotland. Now, the significance of this is that it has created a momentum moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that before this, climate change was not an issue. It was. You have the Kyoto Protocol and so forth, but it didn't gain that much wide attraction worldwide. But since Paris Agreement 2015, it has. And it was reported that among the bankers, the insurers, the investor that has at their disposal 130 trillion at their disposal, they want to combat climate change, and they want to put it as the center of their work, and therefore it puts green investing on a firmer footing. What is also important is another related development that is at the government level, and at least 19 countries are expected to commit to ending public financing for fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of 2022, that is this year. Next, please. It has been estimated that all this energy investment to finance net zero by 2050 ranges from $3.1 trillion to $5.8 trillion annually until 2050. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to emphasize the number is in trillion, not in millions or billions, it's in trillion. So there's a lot of money. And when there's money, as I remember, it was, as Professor Millen was saying, fraud typically is motivated by greed. So we will hang on this, and then when it comes to the challenges, we'll talk about the fraud part of it. Suffice to say that sustainable finance has a significant role to play in driving the energy transition and then sustainable business practice abroad, more broadly. Okay, so what are the opportunities that sustainability has created? Number one is renewable energy, be it solar, wind, geothermal, or tidal, meaning in short that fossil fuel energy would be on the downslide. Not necessarily zero, but downslide. It also would be, the other growth area is auto industry in the electric vehicle as well as the autonomous vehicle, meaning that our current combustion engine using fossil fuel will again be of a lower priority. The other thing that is coming out is in the aviation industry. Currently, sustainable aviation fuel is available, and has been reported that Singapore Airlines is trying out this sustainable aviation fuel, and it should be able to replace, to some extent, fossil fuel. As we know, civil aviation is becoming a big part of our life, so it's going to contribute quite a bit. What we see is that in terms of waste disposal, traditionally and commonly and the cheapest is to bring all the waste, the garbage, to the landfill. And it creates itself a problem. It's just kicking the bucket forward. So what we are looking at is in incinerating it, burning it, as well as those parts that can generate power generation. Next, please. The other growth area is banking and finance. As it is the green or impact investing in equity or in unit trust, the green financing either in bond or loan. And this is the essential service is important because it helps to identify, it helps to define what is green, right? And this is an important aspect that we'll come to in terms of monitoring and deterring fraud and crime. And the first off is sustainable reporting framework as well as the assurance, like Global Reporting Initiative and the Accountability AA1000 standard for assurance. The other thing we have is certification, and this is the famous one is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, Rainforest Alliance, and so forth. Verification. This is something newer because it is an offshoot from the Net Zero Emissions Initiative on carbon trading and credit, which we will talk a bit more later on in my later slides. But and of course, not the least, accounting and auditing. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges given that we see that there's so much money coming out? Okay, so one of the biggest challenges is greenwashing. And the UK Financial Conduct Authority defined it as marketing that portray an organization, product, activity, or policy as producing positive environmental outcome when it is not the case. So the question we got to ask is how serious it is and for how long it has been happening. So just to give you a few, cases, a flavor of what's involved. Next, please. This just happened last month, June of this year. The German police has raided Deutsche Bank Frankfurt office for alleged greenwashing. Now, we all know that Deutsche Bank is not a small bank. It's not only the biggest bank in Europe, but it has worldwide offices. And if the German police is going to raid that office, they must have something, they have good probable cause, let me use the word, to go for it. But this is still under investigation, so the result is still unknown. So we will go to the next one that is already been discovered and the cases has been settled. Next, please. And this is probably the most prominent and largest, and it is nicknamed Dieselgate. It involves Volkswagen in the cheating of its emission. Right. What it is that Volkswagen installed a software to modify and detect when their diesel power engine were being tested, changing the engine performance accordingly to improve environmental test result. So they were discovered in 2015, and somewhere in September 2015, Volkswagen admitted to the cheating. And they had to recall and rectify over 11 million vehicles. You have thought that this is confined to Volkswagen. No. It involves the other major, your BMW and Mercedes, in the diesel engine. So here you have a situation whereby one is the current and one that has already happened in 2015, and the cases and the liability and the civil claim has more or less been cleared. But it's just to tell you that this is greenwashing is a major challenge. Next, please. Now, Asia is not a speck of greenwashing as well, unfortunately. So, as I mentioned, the RSPO is one of the world's most well-known certification, simply because, well, palm oil is one of the more cheaper and globally accepted and used in many other byproducts. So what it is that its RSPO members had been continuously exposed for violation of the RSPO own standard, which include land rights, deforestation, air pollution caused by slash and burn clearing method, and international labor law, which include child labor and forced labor. So what it has become is that in RSPO approval, instead of being a seal of quality, it has been used as greenwashing because consumers are misled that the product is sustainable and good for the environment. Thank you. Now, this one is a bit of a newer compared to greenwashing, because of the fact of the zero carbon emission, net zero emission drive that the initiative that the world is going through. So there are two schemes here. So this first scheme is the cap and trade method, which is where the industry, the government sets the limit to the entire industry or the company, and then for those who don't meet, that means your pollution exceed the cap, then you get fined, you get penalized. And those who that achieve a pollution level that is below, then you can trade this allowance. So this is the carbon trading, cap and trade. Next, please. The next is called carbon credit, or it's called carbon offset or carbon offset credit. What it is it has to be measurable, it has to be verified, that the emission is reduced from this certified climate change project. Okay, so individual or company can purchase this credit funding the project that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So take for example, if you have a plot of land, let's say 1 hectare in Indonesia, somewhere in Kalimantan or anywhere, okay, and you want to have this remain as a forest, you can have it certified and get your carbon credit, right? And then you can sell this to whoever offer you a agreeable price. Next, please. So the certification has the one major certification standard is the Clean Development Mechanism. It is a UN-run program that allows countries to fund greenhouse gas emission reduction project and trade with one another. Okay, and such project will generate what they call as the Certified Emission Reduction, or CER. And this CER can be traded among participants who needs, for example, the emission target. So if you are a power plant that is transiting from coal to say natural gas, and in the meantime you can't meet the cap on your emission, then that is also one other option. Okay, next please. So what's the challenge? The challenge, as usual, is the verification process. And what are the issue here is that, number one, the first risk is of double counting, that the same plot of land or part of it has been counted twice, and that there are this carbon credit that is given twice. The other thing is similar to the RSPO is the monitoring and the enforcing to make sure that such project remain as it is, not that it has been used for something else. Like for example, it has been converted for industrial or commercial use. So that is the monitoring and enforcing part of it. That is the challenge. Next, please. Now, a green crime has been happening quite a bit. The United Nations describe it as illegal activity harming the environment and aim at benefiting individual or group of company. And this trading of natural resources is a serious crime, it's transnational, and it is very organized. Next, please. So one of the example that we highlight here is the trading of wildlife. Okay, wildlife could be elephant tusk, rhino horn, or the live wildlife, which is the endangered or protected species. So it is $258 billion a year, and it is on top of illegal drugs, human and weapon trafficking. So this is also another challenge that we have in the sustainability space. Next, please. Okay. We have talked quite a bit about the environment. Let me talk a little bit about the social and the governance. Let me take the governance first. The governance is very clear. We got to improve transparency, accountability, being responsible, and fairness. My other speakers has covered quite extensively on this point, like Professor Norman talking about contract-related party transaction. And I'm sure following me, Professor Peter will talk more about corporate governance being for avoiding fraud. So I don't have to say too much about this area. Suffice to say that it is important, right? Okay, social. So social, we are looking at, for example, as we mentioned about child labor and forced labor and diversity. That is also something that we are lagging behind. Thank you. Next, please. So as we can see, one of the challenges here is navigating effectively into ESG disclosure. That remains a challenge in the sense that there is no global consensus, right, of what is sustainable, how we can assess and measure it in terms of the investment and in terms of the climate risk. Yeah. Next, please. So this is my opinion of probable solution. And I guess the first thing is that, leading from the last what I've said, is that the previous slide is that we need to come to a global consensus of what is the definition and the taxonomy of what activity are sustainable and what is not. That is very important, because without a starting point, it becomes difficult to pin down things. Okay. The other thing is that we need to come to a new comprehensive global baseline of high quality sustainable disclosure. The good news is that after the during the COPA 26 conference in Scotland, there was formed ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standard Board, that was tasked to come out with this comprehensive global baseline. So what does it needs to include? Okay, it needs to include, which is what is already done, organizational strategy and action on achieving sustainability. But this climate change goal has not been there. So one of the framework that many jurisdiction is looking at is called the TFCD, Total Task Force on Carbon Disclosure. They are working toward that, and I think that is good. We need to compare, organizations need to compare what they are doing to their chosen or relevant UN SDG goals. And also the other thing is that there is not done too much is comparing it to their respective national determined contribution to climate change, right? That has not been done, and I think that will take a little doing as well. Next, please. The other thing is that setting science-based target, meaning that you can measure and you can, it is ambitious and it's meaningful to the organization. To some extent, this is already happening. In terms of implementation measure and evaluates its goal, this is happening, but honestly, this is good enough because this is self-reporting. Okay, and I will mention about the need for assurance. Independent third-party assurance, because self-regulation doesn't work. We have seen it many times in many instances, seen from Enron to WorldCom to the Lehman Brothers. Okay, and number 4 is transparency. Tracking and reporting is goal. It is happening, but it is often happen only at the annual report. So some tightening needs to be done here. Next, please. Okay. Now on the regulatory front, I think there is a need to enact or revise law with regards to greenwashing, carbon washing, which is a very new thing, and green crime. I know that there are enough law with regards to cheating, to criminal misrepresentation. But here again is where the definition is becoming difficult. What they are catching is the big boys, but down the middle that is happening. And I will see that with carbon credit, carbon trading becoming more popular and the money involved is so large, then this is another red flag area, if one can call it. Green crime is already happening there, but it's just tightening up some of the thing. And one other thing that needs to be tightened, personally, I would say that enhance the deterrent penalty, especially the jail term for offenders, because the kind of illicit trade they are doing, they are earning big money. So being fined, they can afford it most of the time. But jail term is something they cannot afford. Then coming to the organization, the same thing here. In the past, big organization that have flouted the rules, the law, breached the law, they end up having monetary fine or suspended. I think that is not good enough, because when you fine and suspend, it is the shareholders that suffers the penalty. And if they are big enough and there's the bailout from the country, okay, then it is the taxpayers. There should be jail term for the responsible individual up the management hierarchy who is responsible. Okay, because the same thing here. These people money is no issue, but jail term, their freedom is a big issue. So it must have that deterrent effect. Okay, coming to this third-party assurance of sustainability and carbon emission disclosure, it is very important. It must have strict guideline and similar to external auditing of financial report, meaning that the rules and the regulating of such assurer must be there. Because if not, then this is one loose end that is waiting for more the likes of Enron or the Lehman Brothers to happen. Why? Because the money involved in this is very big. As you have seen earlier on, it goes into the billion and the trillion. So if you bring it down to individual business, it could well be into the 50 and 100 millions. So that is significant. Otherwise, the assurance is still leaving a big hole to be sabotaged. Okay, and last but not least is the fact that respective regulatory body, their monitoring and enforcement authority must be strengthened. Otherwise, they will have difficulty in coming to terms with to catch up with some of these offenders. I think my last slide, and I will say thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you, and I look forward to sharing with you during the question and answer session. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Pak John, Professor John Lee. And I believe that some of you have some questions or issues to raise, but the session will be later on after the session of Professor Peter Verheesen. Now, without further ado, now we have to proceed to the next session. Our speaker will be Professor Peter Verheesen. The topic will be why corporate governance now to curb fraud. A bit about Professor Peter. Professor Peter's fields of expertise, I think it is important, is on the field of governance practices and risk management and ESG and sustainable investments. Also strategy, wise decision making and ethical leadership and digital innovation and all machine learning. Yeah. And Professor Antwerp is now a professor at Antwerp Management School of the University of Antwerp, Belgium. Okay, I think Professor Antwerp is ready already. Yeah. Now I invite Professor Peter Verheesen. Peter, time is yours. Professor Peter. Professor Peter.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Clear. Professor Peter. Okay, you can start now. All right, time is yours.
Do you want me to upload the presentation, or you will do that from your side?
We already upload the presentation file.
Is this the one? Okay. All right.
From here.
All right. I'm just wondering whether
It's
because I'm trying to push.
ready for you, Prof.
Okay. I try to move it, but it doesn't make any movement on this side. Is there something I should do? I'm trying to move, but nothing is happening. Oh yeah, there it is. Did I do that, or is that you did? I guess you from your hand. So
Someone here.
can I just ask them for next slide? So I'll just mention it because I cannot do anything from this side. So if I just say next slide, is that all right with you?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right.
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay, good. Well, I'm ready. You want to say a few things, or can I start? Or
You can start.
all right. So the topic today, maybe we can go to the title again once more. Next, the previous slide, please. One more. Yes. So the issue is about corporate governance, whether it can curb and reduce fraud. And if it does, why now? Because corporate governance has been in business for, yeah, I should say 150 years and more. So why now? Why is corporate governance being seen as a potential tool to curb fraud? That's a topic I want to start with. So please, next slide. Okay, so I want to do three things. One is briefly to be on the same page as everybody. I just want to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. What is corporate governance, and what are those fiduciary duties that has been elaborated across the world in any organization, be it for-profit or non-profit. Then I want to talk a little bit more particularly about Indonesia and the particular risks that any emerging market as Indonesia is running. And then I'll finish with, in fact, the core of the subject, the issues around unethical fraud that is being seen as the opposite of ethical decisions and or legal compliance, which of course is part of what corporate governance is about. Next slide, please. All right, let's start with the first one, corporate governance. Next slide. What is corporate governance? All right, so what you do see on this one as just an introduction and a kind of a summary of what corporate governance is. Basically, governance is derived from the Latin gubernare, and it really means etymologically that any organization or the captain of the ship in this case steers the ship away from rocks into open waters to explore opportunities. In business terminology, it means that any board of directors, and in Indonesia we have a dual tier board, that any board of directors, especially the BOC or the board of commissioners, that they are responsible to steer the organization away from risks, including fraud, towards what we call business opportunities. And the way that they do that is based on four major principles that has been agreed without too much of an issue across most borders. So most countries agree on those four principles of what we call good corporate governance. The first one is transparency and the disclosure of financial and non-financial information in the most trustworthy manner. Second is so-called fairness and equal stock rights. Three is the accountability of the board to its shareholder and the public at large, especially when it's a public listed company on the stock market. And then four, the issues around responsibility. Now, how they do that? Well, legally speaking, we have so-called fiduciary duties, and those are the fiduciary duties of care and loyalty, and these are legal terms. And I'm adding here an often forgotten duty, which is the fiduciary duty of prudence. Why? Because, as I will explain, or if time allows, when we talk about duty of care and loyalty, it really means that any board member, be it BOC or BOD, board of directors or board of commissioners, that they need to make informed decisions in the interest of the organization. And that's the care part. But the informed decisions refers to minimizing risk, which refers to the prudence part. The loyalty refers to that the organizational goals always prevail over personal goals, which means, for instance, that you will keep confidential information to yourself, as a board member. And one of the often heard fraudulent behavior is, for instance, inside trading. Now, inside trading is a typical example of the violation of the fiduciary duty of loyalty, because you are disclosing illegally and immorally some information to outsiders that take advantage of inside information that you may have as an insider of a board. Anyway, so those three duties usually lead, if you indeed apply it and apply good corporate governance practices, usually it leads to lesser risk and a higher return on invested capital. That's usually what we see in the market. Now, when we talk about why is then corporate governance important and why is it in fact becoming so popular these days? Well, let's not forget that for many years and historically, and please read the book that's mentioned there if you're interested to get more details. Historically, there has been an asymmetry of information between, on one hand, the owners and on the other hand, the managers, especially if there is a split in a sense that if owners, families do not run the business themselves anymore, but have hired professionals to run the organization on their behalf. And as you can imagine, the managers may have the objective to optimize their own objectives, like remuneration packages, which are not necessarily the same as what shareholders want or owners want, which basically is the optimizing the profitability over a longer term. Now, that's the typical agency problem that we see in the Western world. What we have argued in the book that is just published is that in Asia, in particular also in Indonesia, that agency problem is not a big issue. Okay, and so therefore, and when we talk about corporate governance and how it will help to reduce fraud, we have to be a little bit more careful and not to generalize. And the reason is that in Asia, most businesses are either family-run or state-owned enterprises. And there, the issue of governance is not much the issue between managers, powerful managers, and owners, that you, and especially dispersed ownership that you see in the West. In Asia, we have concentrated ownership, and whether the organization is managed by the owners or by professionals, it doesn't make a big difference. What makes a difference in terms of corporate governance is that we have the potential conflict of interest between majority owners versus minority owners, be it local or foreign minority owners. And I'm talking here about, obviously, public listed companies. Next slide, please. So what is governance today? Again, without going in detail, that's how it looks like. We have owners at one hand, and then you have the board in the middle, which plays indeed an incredibly important role in making the ultimate decisions about an organization. And then, of course, you have the management. And then you have externally, let's say, players in corporate governance, be it the government, the regulator, or stakeholders, or industry associations. Again, I'm not talking too much about it. What I want to say, though, and what's important for us around the issue of fraud, why is corporate governance so crucial today? So why now? Well, very simple. I was very privy to have seen the devastating consequences of the so-called Asian flu, the Asian crisis in '97. So I was working for the Indonesian Bank Restructuring Agency, Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, where we were mandated under the supervision of IMF to restructure the debt of organizations in Indonesia. And the reason for that was that all the banks in Indonesia were nationalized and the non-performing loans were taken off the balance sheet and put into a separated entity, which was the bad debt bank for whom we were working, or on whose behalf we had the mandate to restructure indeed those debt. Now, why do I say that? Well, for the simple reason that the cause of the Asian flu was partially corruption and fraud. partially an economic crisis. Now, it's very hard to determine the exact percentage, but I've heard officials saying that because of the inappropriate behavior, if not illegal behavior, of tycoons mainly in Southeast Asia, be it Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, but to a certain extent also Singapore. But Singapore managed to escape the flu a little bit better because of its institutional structure that helped them to overcome it easier. But Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, South Korea, they suffered quite a bit, and mainly because of weak corporate governance. The boards did not fulfill their fiduciary duty of care, loyalty, and especially prudence in that period leading up to 97, when in July in Bangkok, the crisis erupted. Now, similarly, we see the same thing happening again 10 years later in the global financial crisis in 2008 in the US, this time with the subprime mortgage crisis. That also is the result of weak corporate governance structure in the banking sector. Again, mainly because weak prudential behavior by the bankers, and more particularly the investment side of the story. It was not necessarily illegal, but it was definitely inappropriate, driven by greed and so on and so forth. And the structures were not were not in place to waiver such a crisis, and it rolled over the Western world. This time, Asia was not much affected for the simple reason. And again, I spoke to bankers for the simple reason that in Asian banks, particularly Indonesia, Thailand, did not engage in those toxic instruments that led up to the global financial crisis in the Western world. But again, what I'm saying is that in those two instances, both in Asia as well in the Western world, it was weak corporate governance that facilitated, if you like, the possibility causing this kind of crisis. One more illegal in unethical behavior, the other one unethical, driven by greed. Next slide, please. So here you see what I call the bad and the ugly of corporate governance. Quite often, boards were seen, and I'm saying where, it's improving quite dramatically over the last 20 years of what I've seen in Indonesia, and also that one we describe in the book, the boardroom. But what boards should not be yes men or rubber stamping boards. The board has a function to fulfill, and it's forgotten too often, especially in emerging markets, but even in boards in the Western world, especially family businesses. You don't want a shareholder board where one person, the patriarch or the matriarch, decides everything. A board is there to play the devil's advocate, to really, let's say, debate the decisions to be made to steer the organization towards indeed opportunities, but also to reduce risk. So boards are not managing organizations, but are governing. And governing means you need to really question what's going on. You're supervising your management, but you're also advising management. And of course, you guarantee succession plan. These are the three major functions of board. And that has a real function to fulfill. You don't want to have the number 3 there. You don't want the good old boys board either, where, you know, graduates from the same university, they're just pointing each other and they just have fun. No, that's not what it's meant to be. You don't want a country club board either, obviously, and you don't want a trophy board where, you know, oh, I'm appointed to Pertamina today. Wow, that's really the ultimate of my career. I would say, well, my gosh, if you're at Pertamina, you have an incredibly huge task to fulfill. And then, of course, you don't want paper boards which are there because the law requires boards to exist. The board has a real function to fulfill. Next slide, please. So if you want to, and that's my last slide, I think, for the first part, this whole issue of corporate governance, what corporate governance does is that the board responsible for good corporate governance practices in an organization. Usually we're looking at, and we did that when I was working with IFC World Bank. So we looked at a couple of issues. One is the structure. How is the board structured? Number two, what are the tasks of the board? Are the functions of the directors well defined on paper? Okay. Number three, how is the board composed? Are it all friends, something you want to avoid, or are there indeed real independent board members or board commissioners that will be able to debate important decisions that needs to be made? And then, of course, are there processes in place that guarantees certain appropriate behavior to take place when those decisions need to be made? All those are affecting what we call the effectiveness of a board, and therefore, obviously, the potential to reduce fraud in organizations. Next slide, please. All right, so my second part is really briefly talking about, okay, Indonesia as an emerging market. Corporate governance there is still applicable, all the principles I just explained, but there are particular issues that you have to focus on. Next slide, please. So this one is basically something that is close to my heart. What you do see is that if you're looking at stock markets, but even non-listed companies, board members, owners always have expectations about the profits to be made. And so if you put it in a formula as a finance person, basically it means that the expected return on investment on any stock, I in this case, is a combination of two major components. One is the beta return, which is the industry average. The industry can be attractive or unattractive. For instance, software development businesses are quite attractive with averages quite high in terms of industry profitability. And so mathematically, it's basically a beta, multiply that with the market return minus the risk-free return that you get from a state-owned bond or the BI bonds in Indonesia. That is what we call the industry profitability, okay, on average. So that's one. Second is the alpha return, which is really the result straight from strategic and risk management, which is the return above the average. Just an example, IKEA, that you're familiar with, which is the Swedish furniture company. It's a non-listed company, by the way. It's estimated that they make a profit of about 15–20% over the last 15 years. If you know that the average in the industry is about 5%, which is this beta return, then by definition, if we say the total overall return for IKEA is 15%, well, then you know that the alpha return is 15 minus the 5 average is 10%. So the alpha return, which is directly the consequence of having a good strategy and risk management, is about 10% for IKEA. Now, it doesn't finish there. So you have also advisors, you have legal advisors, consultants, and whatever you have. And I was very fortunate to have a lunch with Mr. Professor Scholes, who got the Nobel Prize Economics a couple of years ago. We had a lunch with some other people, and he explained us that indeed those intermediaries, call it omega here, are able to mitigate risk, including fraud if necessary. Be it legal advisors, bank advisors, consultants, and that those intermediaries could have a positive effect on the return on invested capital. It may be marginal, a couple of points only, but it may have a positive impact. And that made me think. And so I said, okay, if for example, Indonesia, where I live, part-time is able to manage their specific risks. And I'm thinking about two major risks here. One is corruption, and the other one is intellectual property rights violation. That is typical, an issue in most emerging markets. I call it Z, which are typical risks in Asia and Latin America and Africa, emerging markets, in other words, that you need to manage. And so what I decided to do is to do some research on that and find out how can we manage those particular risks as part of the fiduciary duty of prudence within a board that reduces the potential to fall in the trap of that Z risk. And so the more you're able to do so as a board member, as a manager, the better it's going to be for your expected return on invested capital. And invested on equity. Next slide, please. And so what we did was briefly, and for those interested, you can read the book mentioned there. We looked at two major variables. My colleagues at University of Melbourne and some friends, in this case, as you see there, Natalia Subaju was the chairman of Transparency International, Indonesia, and board member worldwide in Berlin. What we did was we looked at two major issues, using data from the Indonesian stock market, globally, not from Indonesia or just Indonesia, but globally from the World Bank. And what we did was we looked at whether the rule of law was enforced properly and whether there was a conflict of interest. Okay. And that was basically indicated by whether we had concentrated ownership or not. And what you do see is that Indonesia there, right under, has an incredibly high form of concentrated ownership. 58%, I don't know whether that's still today, this is a couple of years ago, the data at least. The book was published in 2016, the data were 2010, 2015, so that's some time ago. But that time, the 10 largest families in Indonesia controlled 58% of the assets on the Indonesian stock exchange, which is quite extensive and therefore concentrated. And by consequence, you could argue there is potential conflict of interest between the majority owners and then minority owners that are investing in those organizations. So that was one particular issue we looked at. The other one is whether the rule of law is properly applied. And then we see that Indonesia, unfortunately, with other Asian countries, do have what we call institutional voids, which means that the rule of law is not necessarily well applied. You may have a lot of rules, but they're not necessarily enforced as they should. And that's the opposite in the US and UK. That doesn't mean that the US and the UK are better corporate citizens or more ethical people. No, not at all. But it means that under the common law system that the US and the UK have, and that's the result of 800, or should I say 1200 years of history in England, whereby the battle between the absolute power of the monarch, the king, versus the aristocracy and the peasants, if I may call it them, has been underway. And the Magna Carta in 1215 was the first one that curbed the absolute power of the king. Hence why under the UK common law system, you have an emphasis on protecting the property rights of everybody, definitely initially the aristocracy, but then later also everybody, all citizens in the world, or within the jurisdiction of the English Empire. And that's also the reason Malaysia and Singapore and Hong Kong are indeed well rated, or reasonably well rated in terms of enforcement of the rule of law, because of the common law system, which is not the case in the civic law system that Indonesia is characterized by, taking over the civic law system of the Dutch system. So what you do see is that Indonesia is rather weak in terms of enforcement of what I call property rights. And at the same time, there is that high potential conflict of interest. Next slide, please. The result of that is, if you take those two together, the research shown that you have illegitimate rent-seeking behavior, be it corruption, patronage, fraud, and intellectual property rights violation. And so that's unfortunately the consequence of indeed not having the institutions helping you to protect property rights, while at the same time, the incredible power of the families and or the state. Next slide, please. That brings me to the last part and the real topic, but of course I've already led up to that, how to deal with fraud. Next slide, please. I make a distinction between legality and ethics. Ethics is indeed about virtuous and being excellent. Legality has to do with the minimum requirements that you need to comply with. And so fraud can be both and is both illegal as it is unethical. And the question is, where does it stand to? How do you perceive it? Now, obviously, from a country perspective, you are more concerned about the legality of issues than you are with the ethics. As a board member, you think about both, because legality gives you the right to play on the soccer team. I mean, if you're in the championships, then you need to comply with the rules of law. So if you comply with that, then you're allowed to play. But that doesn't make you the champion. You're going to be the champion only when you're excellent. And so in terms of ethics, that's crucial to create an environment where the productivity of employees increases as a result of good behavior and so on and so forth. So when we talk about fraud, you need to think about those two elements. It's both illegal as it is unethical, or what we call immoral. Next slide, please. So this one is very simple, and I did add last night, but you don't see it here. There is some studies by Ingo Walter today at New York Stern Business School, and that said that unethical behavior, or let's say illegal and unethical behavior, call it aggressive, if not illegal accounting practices at the New York Stock Exchange, trying to push up the what's that now, balance sheet or profit and loss statement by pushing up the sales to beat the expectations of the analysts. And if the SEC, the regulators, get you caught and disposes you, well, that the market is reacting. And so the result of the very interesting research shown that, okay, if you try for each dollar, you try to illegally push up the stock market by having a higher sales number, and that's fraudulent behavior, okay, that the market will be without mercy. And so for each dollar, you will lose $3.7. Now, if you then distinguish, basically there are three actors there, but the most important one is that you have the regulatory compliance legal settlements, and that's basically equal to the $1 for each dollar you try to cheat. But it's the market, the client defections, the increased firm-specific risk premiums charged by banks, and therefore included, or that's incorporated in the stock market price. So for each dollar that you are trying to cheat and you get caught, that will be penalized by a 3.7 decline per $1 you tried, market loss as a result of mainly reputational loss. So the market is without mercy, and reputation is crucial for those who have tried to cheat, call it fraud or whatever the definition. Next slide, please. Okay, another one I have still 10 minutes, is that correct? What I want to show you here very briefly, how fraud is a hard one. As I said, corruption is a big issue in most emerging markets. What I did here is I distinguished the bribery from gifts. And quite often, government officials who have monopoly power are involved in corruption, not because they are more corrupt than others, but because they are in a position to take advantage. And so for them, XY being the bribe, what is in for them, it's the bribe itself, the money, but there are constraining factors. And similarly, for the ones that is giving the bribe, the production person who gets benefits or is coerced either way. It's basically a Cobb-Douglas function, price quantity minus cost quantity, minus also a bribe, because that's of course a tax or a cost for the business person. And similarly, there are three constraining factors. Reputation, remember I just mentioned that in a study by Ingo Walter, the norms that are violated as a result of bribery or fraud, and then whether you are crossing the law, L. And what you do see, and again, usually it takes me half an hour to just explain that formula, but what I can tell you is that unfortunately reputation and norms are not really constraining, despite you being my very pious people, be it Muslim, Christian, Confucian, whatever your religion, Hindu, Buddhist, in any religion it's forbidden. I can tell you in the Al-Quran, where it is mentioned explicitly, as it is in the Bible, as it is in the Vedantas. The point is that unfortunately, in reality, that doesn't really constrain people to be corrupt. So what's left over in the studies that I looked at or that I did is law. And I have two levels of law. One that we have been referring to, the criminal law at a national level, but also at the corporate level, which is then, of course, corporate governance. And what you do see is that's the only constraining factor that can curb fraud. And unfortunately, if you have weak corporate governance at the firm level, then fraud will take place. And if you have institutional voids, which is the case, unfortunately, in many emerging markets, then yes, fraud is going to be there. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip that one. Yes, so this one is basically the culmination of some thinking that is dealing with risk and fraud. So what is this? What I'm trying to say here is, what is the general risk that fraud would take place in an organization, let's say? So I'm talking, my perspective is really the organizational level and people working in an organization, okay? Well, basically, first of all, we have to think about the general risk. And if we talk about organization, that means then it is the risk that you run at an organizational level that fraud would take place in an organization, okay? What is that? There are two variables that are apparently contributing to fraud, or potentially, okay? The first one is there are always inherent risks that you run as a business, IR. And therefore, those risks are basically part of the way you run a business. And there will always be the potential that somebody will do something fraudulent. So that's indeed something. And who within the organization can focus on that? Well, it is at the board level, it is the risk and or audit committee. Now, by definition, all organizations are especially, I mean, not especially, but mandatory listed public corporations, they will need to have an audit committee, okay? But more and more, and in banks, it's also mandatory, more and more you will see a risk committee. Now, what's the major risk? Or sorry, what's the major difference? The audit committee is looking at the past. Has there been irregular activities happening? And you cannot publish an accounting or an accounting report unless it has been validated by an external auditor, isn't it? And so the reports that are validated by an external auditor should at least reduce some of the risk for fraud, but there's no guarantee. And I can tell you, when I was working for IBRA, that I've seen audit report by one of the big fours, and still considerable fraud and corruption, because remember, audit committees and auditors are not doing anything but to verify whether the transactions are according to the general accepted accounting practices. It doesn't necessarily verify in detail all transactions one by one, okay? And so fraudulent behavior is still possible, even if it's an audited report. The risk committee is looking at the future activities of an organization and whether there are issues to be taken into account. So the first, let's say, wall of defense is at the board level, the risk and audit committee, to limit inherent risks that are part of running your business. The second is the internal control risk, which means how much is the chance that fraud passes the internal control? And that's definitely also part of corporate governance, but also management. Why? Because it's the internal auditor that you can see there that has the responsibility to check and chase any inappropriate behavior that could be caused by fraud. So internal control risk is a second, let's say, barrier or a second defense line against fraud. The third one is called the detection control risk. Now here I made a small mistake in this part of this version of the presentation. It's mentioned there internal auditor. It should be the external regulator, okay? The external regulator. Why? Because DR is looking at the risk that the fraud would go through. Now, the regulator, as in the case of the study of Ingo Walter on the New York Stock Exchange, it was the regulator, the SEC, that did see those inappropriate accounting practices and find them accordingly. So similar, in any country, you have a regulator that is necessary to check whether fraud is taking place or not. And it is the institutional regulator that will need to interfere. And therefore, I call that the institutional legal constraint. That is a third part or a defense system against fraud. And then number 4, it is what I call the moral risk. This is at the individual level. How far are you indeed thinking in the moral terms? What is the integrity of you as a manager or a board member not to commit to fraudulent behavior? And so that is what I call self-regulatory wise leadership. So in other words, corporate governance is crucial, but it's not the only one that can defend against fraud. It is crucial definitely for IR and IC. It is crucial to understand what behavior is appropriate for running your business. And the internal control, the internal auditor, the internal control, reporting directly to the Board of Commissioners is indeed a very important vehicle of management and of the board to track potential fraudulent behavior. And of course, the regulator has to play a role in putting the constraints, the institutional constraints, to say, well, this is permitted and is not. The moral risk is really the individual level, but corporate governance can play a role because you can, what I call, put in your code of conduct, which is signed off as a constraint by the Board of Directors and the Board of Commissioners, that is setting the tone. Now, next slide, please. So let me just finish with this because time is running out, I think. I did do a study, and I didn't show it to you here, but we did do a study with my colleague at Melbourne Business School and for Indonesia. And what we found out in a study that spanned from 2011 to 2015, we looked at randomly 150 organizations at the Indonesian Stock Exchange, and we looked at the variables of corporate governance and the correlation, potentially causal correlation of return on assets. And what we found out, and this is very interesting, what we found out was that there were only a few variables that were statistically significant to explain certain behavior that had a positive or a negative effect on the return on assets, corporate behavior or corporate governance practices. And the one that was really having a significant effect was this, Indonesia, that related party transactions is something that is legal. But we found out in the study that if that's forbidden by the board or is being well organized under very strict constraints, that kind of behavior imposed by the board has an incredible positive impact on the return on assets. And why do I mention that? Because the related party transactions is by most scholars in corporate governance seen as a proxy for potential corruption. Why? Because related party transactions that is allowed, remember, this is legal, is basically a loan by a board member or a top manager borrowing money, a loan from the organization. That's why it's called a related party transaction. However, that money is not owned by the board, it's owned by the shareholders. Quite often, that debt is being converted into equity. And so in that sense, the borrower will never have to pay back that debt, and the money goes in the pocket. And so that's typical an example of an institutional constraint that is not functioning too well unless the board takes it in their own hands. And often it's forbidden in good, well-governed organizations. And I'm thinking about, you should check it. PT Astra, for instance, I would like to see whether PT Astra, because we didn't do it individually, remember? We did it for an aggregate level, 150 companies. We don't know which one was exactly, imposing it, but a company as PT Astra that has been seen in Indonesia as well governed, I'm pretty sure that related party transactions are extremely well taken care of, or likely even forbidden. And so again, at an institutional level, the government should take their responsibility. But I believe more in corporate governance because at least the board can take action. And that's an incredibly important defense system against fraudulent behavior. So if you see proper corporate governed institutions or organizations in Indonesia, I would bet my money on that organization, not on the country level, but on organizations that are well managed, well governed. I think that's crucial. And so my last word is that it's important for any manager and any, especially board member, to be commercially savvy, to make reasonable decisions that is reducing errors and biases. But a board member needs to be wise. And needs to be wise because wisdom has related to your consciousness and therefore your ethical thinking. Of course, the law is the first part to protect you from potential fraud. But as I've seen in many, many emerging markets, hence why my long introduction to it, I don't trust the law and the lawmakers in Indonesia, and by extension, the enforcers of the law, with all due respect. But I do believe in proper governed organizations that do the right thing. And so the wisdom that I can see at an organizational level is crucial. What I do hope is that indeed the regulators at the national level will do their job, but unfortunately I don't see that happening too often. There is an improvement, but again, it's a debate, an ongoing debate. Whether an autocratic system is doing better as a democratic system, well, that's a political debate, and I'm not so sure that either way will be a better constraint against fraud. What I do know is that good corporate governance and indeed including the high integrity of its officers at boards, that those can constrain and limit fraud. And hence why I wish everybody to be a little bit more wise instead of just being a person making money for the organization. Thank you so much. I'm open for questions, obviously.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor.
Oh, that's the first study, by the way. If you go back just two slides, one more, and one more. So one more, yeah. So these are the, sorry, go back. So, yeah. So you have about 33 variables, and you see in red the ones that really have a significant impact. Again, it's a study that you can read if you like to.
All right.
Go ahead for questions, please.
Thank you, Professor Peter Verheyen, for sharing some important issues regarding the corporate governance and fraud. And of course, the question raised by him, why corporate governance now to curb fraud, already been well answered by Professor Peter Verheyen. And we also have listened some important issues regarding this. Okay, now we shall move to the QA session. Okay, already been announced there in the chat box by Ibu Yeni. You can write down your question in the chat box. Okay, let me start from the beginning. The first question from Bu Fahriani, Indonesia, from the Supreme Audit Agency of the Indonesian government. The question is, in public sector, I think fraud has been planned at the budgeting process, because budgeting is the first step in the budgeting formulation. So what do you think, what do the speakers' opinion about this? So this is the issues in the public sector. Number two, about moral risk, how to determine the moral risk. All right, so the next question from Pak Idris from Koperasi Jasa Audit. Yeah, the question is, can the small and medium enterprises apply the general risk in the complete formula? I mean, I think apply the corporate governance, yeah, and anticipate risk in the, or manage risk in the complete formula. The third question from Supreme Audit Agency of Indonesia, Pak Simarmata. The question is, has good internal control been able to guarantee that future risks will be controlled, include fraud? If not, what else can be controlled? Yeah, I think that's all first. More and more questions appeared here. So if the speakers can, can grab the question, can read the question. So I'd like you to answer that questions. Okay, to set the time, without further ado, I'd like to let the speakers to answer that question.
Can I ask the second question directly, because it's quite simple? Is that all right?
Hang on a minute.
Can SME supply corporate governance and anticipate risk?
The next question is from Fahria, right? Yeah, about moral risk. How to determine the moral risk?
No, what I'm saying is that's also willing to answer. Okay, let me answer that one. Moral risk is indeed something that is very hard to measure. I've done a lot of studies on ethical behavior. Basically, about everybody in the world agrees, in order to be trustworthy, you need to have high integrity. And so those who do not have integrity, which is very hard to measure for the simple reason that integrity is based on your own consciousness, which implies the intention to behave ethically, and only can be seen in its behavior. And so in descriptive morality, there are a lot of studies that are indicated what are factors that will increase the moral risk of not being of high integrity. So it's a very good question, but it would lead me far away or take me quite some time to explain it. But I can tell you it's crucial. Morality, and again, you have four major venues in morality, be it utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, contract, whatever it is, you can define morality as proper behavior within the norms accepted in a certain society. And so one of the things, for instance, that I have seen, if you talk about corruption, for instance, or bribery, that certain behavior is accepted in a country like Thailand or Indonesia and may not be accepted in, let's say, Denmark. Okay. And so that's where the morality is a little bit relative. But at the end of the day, everybody across cultures is clear that non-integrity is something that will not function. And so in that sense, again, I'm more than happy. You can mail me and have an individual conversation with you. I can give you a whole theory about what morality means and what the moral risk are. But it is indeed true. It is much harder to determine excellence versus minimal compliance, which is what the law defines. So legality is much more precise than ethics. That is true. And that complicates the matter. But let's not forget, it is the law and the lawmakers who should be very clear to make the law and define what is fraud and enforce it. I have said ethics is one additional factor to make you a champion, okay? And without that, you're never going to be a champion. So that's the first one. Answering that third question or the second question on SMEs applying good corporate governance, yes, very simple answer. Of course, any organization applying those principles of transparency, fairness, accountability, and responsibility that needs to be contextualized, that will reduce the risk. Yes, that's in short. Please give the floor to some maybe other speakers as well who may like to add.
Okay, I would like to invite other speakers who would like to comment to the questions raised by the audience. Professor Mailin.
Yeah, maybe I would like to add, maybe I would like to answer some of the questions related to risk during the budgeting process in the public sector and also in the SME. I think once we put a proper governance in a company, we need to implement, whether it is a public sector or in the SME, the risk management framework. So the risk management framework is, can be implemented like from the COSO framework or from ISO or Australia and New Zealand framework. So it contains like 5 to 7 steps of risk planning, assessment, analysis, evaluation, risk treatment, monitoring, reporting, and communication. So I think once the risk, whether it is, one of the important risks is actually the corruption risk. So every entity, whether it is public sector or SME, need to also assess this kind of risk and take necessary action before it happens. Then, the probability and likelihood can be assessed and reported to the risk management committee at the board level. And this risk management committee at the board level has to be very effective in assessing and challenging the evaluation made by the risk manager. I think if it is provided, implemented correctly, it can somehow reduce the occurrence of corruption. That's from my opinion. Thank you.
Okay. The next
Can I
question.
add something there?
All right, Professor Verheesen.
Just briefly.
Yes.
So as I said, on the legal side, not the moral side, but the legal side, there are 2 levels. There's the national level, the criminal law, and you have the corporate level, which is the company law. Now, in the company law, we have established that, and my colleague just mentioned, the risk committee and all that will need, and I've said also the internal control committee or internal control at the management level needs to apply and detect fraudulent behavior, including in the budgeting. But let me give you a very concrete example as a practitioner. Let me ask Indonesian citizens here, how many of those who have corrupted and kind of, may not say proven, but highly indicative corrupt behavior that caused the Asian flu and the bankruptcy of the country, how many are in prison? And I can tell you, not many.
Yeah.
And so to me, and everybody is afraid of KPK, the point I've made is, and I've defended in Oxford. I tell you what, I'll give you one small story. If you look to the NPLs in 97, 98, most banks had NPLs between 20 and 70%, which means they're virtually bankrupt, which was the case. If you look to the NPLs, and I got the figures from the Ministry of Finance himself, if you do the NPLs of the provincial banks, so-called microcredit, those were 2.5% during the crisis, meaning those farmers constituting 70% of the citizens of Indonesia, whether it's under adat or peer pressure or whatever it was, during the crisis, and I felt it much more than the rich people, they paid back their loan in 97.5% of the cases, meaning they were proper ethical citizens. But the tycoons of this world, knowing they will not get caught and penalized in a court of room, in a room of court by an objective, neutral judge, they knew to get off. And that is, to me, one of the major reasons that tycoons, they know they will not be paying for what they did. And so that's, for me, a very simple one. And that's something that I've seen my own eyes, and I've been dealing with tycoons quite a bit. I'm not saying that all of them are, but the point is, if the institutions do not function, then you have a big problem. And so what's left is then that second defense system, which is the corporate governance thing. And that's why I'm a strong believer in that part, but at least I know I can control it. I cannot control a country and judges and police force and whoever it is that is paid to do the duty. And I definitely agree with the public Supreme Court person who mentioned that. Yes, I fully agree with you. It's almost deliberate, a priori, conscious behavior, knowing they were not going to pay back those loans. Yes, definitely agree.
So basically that's relates to the law enforcement. If the law enforcement is weak, then the things that he mentioned by Professor Peter is happen.
I have
all right.
I have something to add to what Professor Peter said. Well, so far as the moral risk is being considered, you may be aware, I mean, many of you may be aware that the top 50 banks in the world, international banks, top 50 banks in the world, all of them, without exception, are involved in money laundering. They have been caught, they have been punished, they have been made to pay fines. Is there an improvement in their moral behavior at the institutional level? We don't know. The reason is that the cost that they pay and the benefit that they get from laundering money, that cost is certainly much lower than the benefit that they get. For example, take the case of Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. It laundered $7 billion. It was caught, it was fined, brought before the US Commission, paid the fine of, I believe, about, my memory maybe about $2 billion was the fine which they paid. But even if you pay 50% of the money that you have laundered as the crime, still you are left with a significant amount of profit. And it is this that that pushes top banks and their top executives to engage into this kind of a immoral behavior. And this is reflected in the Commonwealth Bank scandal. So that's one part of it. And the second part is, if you go to the GFC, Global Financial Crisis, you will find that the bankers were saying that, well, we knew that the risk that we are incurring in engaging in those, sort of subprime transactions, we knew that the risk is certainly very high, but we still engaged in it. And the only reason is, if my neighbor is doing it, why I should not do it? And this is happening at the institutional level. So it is not individual, it is institutional. So that's what I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
Basically, the quality of the governance, good governance, is greatly influenced by the law enforcement in a country. That's what I believe. All right, thank you very much, Professor Setsie. We still have another question from a person, Pak Simarmata from PPK. Do you believe that internal control, can guarantee that future risks can be controlled? Just from the internal control. Okay, any short answer from this one? I still have to mention this one because it is written here.
Yeah, no, I can very briefly. As I said, it's one of the four, what I call in my small model, and I'm excluding, please know, this is just at the firm level. Didn't, and I fully agree with my colleague from Malaysia that at the country level, there should be more strict public governance, but I'm ignoring that for the time being. So answering the question, is internal control sufficient? No, it's necessary, but not sufficient. It's one of the four necessary to reduce the risk of fraud.
Okay. Okay, I think next question from Dimar Alam of Brawijaya University already been answered. Yeah. Next from Pak Irfan Mangkunegara. It is interesting when Professor Verheesen says that every dollar window dressing made will cost the company 3.7 downfall for its share prices. Yeah, the Rolls-Royce bribery case shows us that when it settled for the fine, its share prices was went up. Any comment on this?
Can you repeat the last one? In Rolls-Royce case,
the Rolls-Royce bribery case shows us that when it settled for the fine, its share price went up. Any comment?
Yeah, well, let me give you this example. And in business school, we teach that. The Tylenol case of Johnson & Johnson in '84, which is a typical example of proper risk management. So people died from taking Tylenol. And so Johnson & Johnson was following its credo, its code of conduct quite meticulously, and was transparently communicating what they were doing during that crisis and doing the right thing from a moral perspective. It's the first time that the CEO withdrew all products that potentially could cause damage to customers from the shelves, which was costing 1/4 of the total revenues of Johnson & Johnson in '82, '84. And so they've been consistently doing the right thing from a moral perspective. And that was being well received by the public. When Siemens and Johnson & Johnson themselves in New York or in New Jersey were involved in a bribery scandal, and I'm referring to the Rolls-Royce case here, when Siemens was involved in a bribery scandal, the stock price went down. And so similar, okay. But when Johnson & Johnson was involved in a scandal, the stock price kept stable. And the reason for that was simple. The stock market expected G&G to do the right thing. And they did. They fired the person unceremoniously. And so people believe that the culture within G&G is such that they will adhere to high moral principles more than other organizations. And so in that sense, remember the window dressing issue was indeed New York Stock Exchange. And so that was one study, but I'm pretty sure there are other studies, but it shows that reputation plays a role. And reputation is almost like an insurance policy. If something bad happens, it absorbs some of that risk. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much. There is still another question here, still related to the previous answers given by Professor Peter Verheesen. Let me read this question from Pak Agung Listiadi, Universitas Negeri Surabaya. In poor and developing countries, most laws protect fraud perpetrators. Only the operator law or only the operator or low manager level is prosecuted. How to overcome this? So this is quite frequently happen in Indonesia when there is a big case regarding the fraud. Normally, those prosecuted only low-level managers, but the top executive normally can avoid the the sanctions given by the law in the country. Any comments on this? How to overcome this kind of problem?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question. Why is it? I can tell you why, but I'd like to ask the public. Why? Simple. I mean, come on. Of course, tycoons have money. They have the best lawyers. They're connected with the parliamentary. I mean, I can give you a whole story. I don't want to do this publicly, but please call me. I have cases. I mean, obviously, those with power, those with money, the patronage system is strong. In fact, but I have to then, okay, in all fairness, now I have to be also very clear. Lee Kuan Yew said very clearly himself, it's because the institutions and the rule of law does not function that well, that business people need the network to survive in an opaque environment. So it is the network and the Guangxi and the social capital and those relationships that makes people survive. So I'm not blaming those tycoons just for that. So they're well connected, and they are reason to well connected because that's a way to survive, because the institutions are not. United States of America was extremely corrupt 200 years ago. It took 200 years to build those institutions. So obviously, United States American citizens are not more moral than anybody in Indonesia, on the contrary, but the institutions function well. But that was not my topic. My topic was corporate governance.
Okay.
Yes, public governance is definitely important.
Okay, thank you anyway, Peter. I would like to invite other speaker. Probably you want to add some insight on this issue. If no one would like to add some other issues.
Pak Nurholis.
Oh yeah, Pak Unti.
Yeah,
please.
Yeah, short comment, I think. Participative budgeting, I think, as the implementation of public involvement, development planning, is actually an early stage to prevent fraud, Pak Nurholis. Is the proper application of governance principle, and then supervision by inspectorate, and also proper auditing by the BPK. I think it is a crucial point. And in the present context of Indonesia, about the morality, moral enforcement must be followed by the enforcement of the rule of law. This is my reflection, I think, because many Indonesians have neglected moral virtues and don't even fear God. So that ethics must be followed by law enforcement. Yes, this is my opinion.
Okay, then.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would like to. I would like to quickly.
Yes, please, Professor T.
Yeah, I would like to quickly add a comment here. The person who asked the question said that the top guys go scot-free in developing countries. No, the top guys go scot-free in every country. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation chairman, when she was dragged before the US Congress, apologized. She said, well, I didn't know that this kind of things were happening. And if you go through the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report of the US, you will find that the lower, people working at the lower level were made the scapegoats. So this is a thing which is probably generic everywhere. So not a question of developing country or developed country. Thank you.
True. Can I add something there, Professor? I mean, I agree with you, but please, it is quite clear in a court of law, it needs to be proven that the person in question is innocent till proven guilty. Therefore, it needs to be proven that he or she did not make an informed decision that did cause or that led up to money laundering. Now, quite often the CEO could be aware of that, but you need to prove it in a court of law. And so morally, he definitely, I agree with you, he did the wrong thing because he likely was aware of it. But the court of law still needs to prove that. And likely the one under him or her is the one who did commit it, and that can easily be proven and traced back. So legally and ethically, I make a very clear distinction. And so I do agree with you. And let me add to that, Singapore is like Switzerland. It's the cleanest country or among the cleanest in the world, but the bank vaults are full of dirty money. But having said that, today, and I can tell you that from experience myself, it is much harder to just transfer money because the banks now under the US anti-money laundering law are forced to ask the questions, where's the money coming from? But yes, if you're well connected, you still get through, I'm pretty sure. But I agree with what you say. But I just wanted to refine in terms of you need still to prove the guiltiness of a person. And it's very hard at a board level to prove that person made the decision deliberately to cause fraud. But reputation, therefore, is much easier. And therefore, the Japanese system is quite impressive. If somebody, something happened under the CEO's wings, the CEO will feel to resign. I think that's an incredibly beautiful thing. Whereas in the US and in so many other countries, there are a lot of excuses made. And therefore, I agree. So reputation for me is also a very powerful measurement because it refers to the trustworthiness of a person and not just to the legality of it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we still have 5 minutes. I read here, Fahria, Ibu Fahriani, she's an auditor at the Supreme Audit Body of the Republic of Indonesia, would like to say something. Is it correct, Bu Fahriani? So, Bu Fahriani would like to say something? Okay, Bu Fahriani, can you hear me? All right. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen, participants? Any other comments? Okay. Okay, please open the attendance. Yeah. You can write your attendance here at the form that already been delivered by the organizer. All right. Any other question? Oh yeah, somebody raising hand. Okay, please. Somebody raise hand.
Yes, Pak Devi, you can turn on your microphone.
Pak Dedi Erianto.
Pak Devi Erianto.
Dedi Erianto.
Perhaps you can write down your question or your comment, Pak Devi. Okay.
Bu Fahriani, Pak Nurholis.
Yes,
Okay, Bu Fahriani.
thank you for the opportunity. I would like to answer to Mr. Fete again about my question before about moral risk. As I know, audit formula is audit risk equally inherent risk, multiply control risk, and detection risk. Where is the position about the moral risk? Thank you for the answer.
The last one. I mentioned the fourth one is the moral risk. So you have IR, IC, DR, and then MR. the moral risk. So these are the four potential constraining factors against fraud. But again, moral risk, I used to advise a bank like Société Générale or FEB Paribas and in Singapore. And one of the things we found there is, for instance, if the CEO says, okay, we want these results at any cost. So we want, let's say, result improvement of 50% return on invested capital next year. And he adds 3 words, at any cost. That pushed people to cut corners. So sometimes, and I like to, just to show you how difficult it is to define a moral risk, just these 3 words, at any cost, is pushing employees, subordinates to start behaving unethically. Not because they are bad people, but because they are under pressure by the CEO to do things. So what it means is a whole literature, and I refer to more from Berkeley and Baserman from Harvard and so many others, that says that good people sometimes make bad decisions. So again, it's a little bit more difficult and more shaded and more nuanced and less clear cut. It's not black and white, this moral risk. And so moral risk is a term that is, yes, and I include myself, I use it, but we need to be very careful. It can be religiously inspired, but it also can be pure humanistically from a philosophical perspective to be justified. So there are so many definitions and justifications possible. But what I only wanted to say is that morality is different from legality. It is distinctively different. And it has to do with your internal consciousness, the way you're brought up with norms and values in your society, be it religiously inspired or purely in your community. And in that sense, I have seen atheists that are, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, as good, if not morally superior to many pretending pious religious people from whatever culture they're from. And so to me, I think, yes, you're right. Moral risk is a very contentious notion. I'm writing a paper on integrity right now, trying to define that. And there's a huge literature around it. So I'm more than willing to elaborate whenever you feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to provide you literature around that. But you're right. It's a little bit of a contentious, and we should define that more properly.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, actually time is up, but I still read here one short question. I think this is to Peter. How to measure fraud in quantitative research? It is a new measure method.
Say that again, please.
How to measure fraud in quantitative research? It is a new measure method, like triangle, or maybe there is another measure. Or perhaps this guy is also asking about the proxy use normally.
Oh, okay. What I only said, I didn't study fraud as such. I looked at the connection, or what we call statistical correlations, between corporate governance variables that are implemented in Indonesia versus the return on assets, because I claimed, as many corporate governance experts would, that there is a relationship between applying good corporate governance and reducing risk and improving return on invested capital. So what we found was that related party transactions and the control of that is being seen as positively correlated with a higher return on assets. Which basically interpretation means, most likely, that because I said in the literature, related party transactions is likely a proxy for fraud and corruption, that having the control over that is having a positive effect on the return on assets. That's all what I said. I didn't give a definition of fraud. I'm pretty sure my colleagues may be better placed, especially legal scholars, to define what fraud is in each of the particular jurisdictions.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, I think time is up. As a moderator, I would like to thank all the speakers here, Professor Peter Verheyen, Professor Lee Wan, Professor Mylin Satye, Professor Norman, Mohammed Saleh, and Professor Unti Ludikdo. We would like to appreciate for all of you speakers to be the speaker here in this seminar. And on behalf of the probably Department of Accounting of Universitas Brawijaya, because I think that this topic is very important and probably still relevant to be discussed in the near future. Probably, hopefully, we can arrange another discussion, another forum for this issue. Again, thank you very much. And sorry if, as a moderator, I cannot manage this discussion very well. And again, thank you for all the participants. Yeah, hopefully this session, this seminar will be fruitful for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Farewell.
I pass this time to Furi.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you very much.
yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you so much for the interesting discussions, yeah, and attractive discussions, I think. Thank you so much for our lovely speaker and also all of the participants here. That's all our sessions today, I think. And we, the committee of this international webinar, would like to say many thanks to all of you who have joined in this international webinar today for your participation, for your share together in this webinar. And we do apologize for our mistakes. And thank you very much for your nice attentions. I'm Ayu Pripuspita. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you next time and have a nice day.